For nearly 7 decades of existence, I have harbored an underlying truth that has never been spoken aloud to a single human soul, not in fragments, not by implication, and not hidden behind defensive qualifiers meant to ease the discomfort of its weight. Standing at this point in life, I choose to place this reality at the absolute forefront of my narrative, rather than reserving it for the conclusion, simply because the long decades spent internalizing it are finally at an end. The reality is that matrimony was something I never truly desired. This resistance was present when I was 16, watching the adolescent girls in my district develop an awareness of the opposite sex, while recognizing that my own internal landscape remained completely indifferent to them. This absence of interest persisted at 18, when the communal focus shifted toward the unmarried young women of our district, with a quiet, unyielding expectation that clearly signaled a shrinking timeline for choice. It remained true at 20, when an earnest young man named Eli Herzberger approached my father to request a courtship, an occasion my father shared with me with such unmistakable relief and joy that the expected path became instantly clear, leaving me with no choice but to acquiesce. What followed that agreement was a 4-month period of silent, internal dread, for which I possessed absolutely no vocabulary to convey to the people around me. By the time I reached 22 and Eli extended a proposal of marriage, my affirmation was rooted not in genuine affection or desire, but in a profound inability to conceptualize an alternative existence within a culture that had never once validated the notion that a woman could rightfully reject the institution of marriage altogether. To prevent misinterpretation, a high degree of clarity is required here, as the absence of this distinction caused immense, unnecessary inner turmoil throughout my earlier years. My conflict was not merely a longing for a different variation of matrimony than the one presented to me, though that element certainly existed. It was not a matter of wishing for a different partner, a prolonged engagement, or a more profound emotional bond with my suitor. The void was far more structural than that. It was an absence of desire for the entire institution itself, for the exact life path it dictated, and for the specific transformation that an Amish marriage demanded of a woman during that era. Becoming a wife was not what I wanted, nor did I wish to become a mother in the totalizing, inevitable manner that marriage within our community dictated. The entire existence that matrimony would forge for me was something I rejected, completely independent of the specific man involved, the warmth of the home, or the kindness with which the household might be managed. For several decades, the true nature of my desires remained nameless, and the purpose of this reflection is to give that feeling the most accurate name possible. I do this with the awareness that other women may be listening who have carried a matching, unspoken burden for years or generations, and naming it is the vital first step toward transforming that awareness into something constructive. My marriage to Eli Herzberger occurred on a Thursday, late in autumn. Standing before the bishop and our gathered district at 22 years old, dressed in a blue gown of my own making, I recited the traditional vows as sincerely as my young mind could manage. Yet, buried beneath the surface of those spoken promises was a quiet, suffocating awareness that I was conforming to every communal expectation while violating the most fundamental truth of my own being. The fullness of this journey reveals who I actually was, what my spirit required, and why it has taken nearly 70 years to articulate these experiences openly. The divergence between my peers and myself became apparent during my early youth, though it manifested without theatricality or a singular, sudden awakening. The realization unfolded with the quiet deliberation that characterizes genuine self-discovery, arriving not as a sudden revelation, but as a slow gathering of small, perplexing observations that I stored away in an unmapped corner of my mind. My initial observation centered on how my thoughts regarding the young men of our district differed completely from those of my older sister, Anna. Her focus on them was constant, intuitive, and carried a natural warmth that dictated how she perceived her surroundings. Anna instinctually registered their presence at communal gatherings, noting their mannerisms, their humor, their seriousness, and evaluating their potential as providers or companions. It was a completely instinctive orientation of her attention, whereas my own focus drifted toward entirely different elements. During our community gatherings, my mind gravitated toward the substance of the conversations rather than the individuals conducting them. I immersed myself in the communal labor not out of an exceptional work ethic, though I was perfectly capable, but because the tangible tasks provided an engagement that the social rituals of courtship failed to offer. I found myself drawn to abstract concepts and persistent questions, realizing at an early age that the actual content of life intrigued me far more than the intricate social web of romantic alignments that occupied the minds of the girls around me. For a long time, the implications of this divergence remained obscure to me, and I rationalized it as a sign of delayed maturity, a serious disposition, or a temporary phase that would eventually give way to the romantic interests shared by my sister and peers. By my late teens, however, it became undeniable that the explanation was far more intricate, even if the vocabulary to define that complexity remained entirely out of reach. Within our district lived an unmarried woman named Sister Martha, who was in her 60s during my youth. Having reached an advanced age, she occupied a position that shielded her from the relentless social expectations directed at younger, single women. She possessed a genuine, deep-seated respect from the community, a dynamic I only fully appreciated as I grew older and recognized it as the deference granted to someone who has navigated an unconventional path so long that the community has ceased to question it. Throughout those formative years, I observed Sister Martha with the intense focus of someone searching for confirmation that a non-traditional existence could be successfully endured. She maintained her own home, supported herself through her exceptional skill as a quilter, and generated an independent income at the local market that granted her a level of self-sufficiency nearly unheard of among our women. Her regular attendance at church and her active role in communal affairs demonstrated that she remained a vital, respected member of the district. Her life did not appear diminished by the lack of a traditional family structure. Rather, she seemed to possess a distinct completeness and an authenticity that many married women lacked, as if remaining unburdened by marital roles allowed her the freedom to simply exist as herself. Although the immense gap between my internal observations and my capacity for speech prevented me from ever initiating a conversation with her, her visible dignity and competence provided the silent validation I desperately needed. She was living proof that a woman who rejected the universal path was not inherently flawed, and that her marital status did not define her worth. I quietly integrated this evidence into my growing repository of internal truths, remaining silent and waiting for a future I could not yet envision. Eli Herzberger was truly an honorable man, a description I offer with absolute sincerity rather than as a polite platitude. Throughout our early years together, he extended a degree of patience that far exceeded what I offered him, as the version of myself I brought to the marriage was consistently detached. While I remained dependable, industrious, and entirely dedicated to the operational success of our household, there was a vital emotional reservation that he undoubtedly sensed, even if he lacked the vocabulary to confront it. Within the initial 4 years of our union, we welcomed 2 children into our lives. It is essential to state clearly that my affection for my offspring was absolute and overwhelming, a reality that deeply relieved the private anxieties I had harbored before their births. I had secretly feared that an aversion to the lifestyle of marriage would translate into a resentment of the children produced by it, but the reality was entirely different. My rejection was directed solely at the institution and the rigid social expectations imposed upon a wife, an issue entirely separate from the profound love I felt for my children. Untangling my genuine maternal affection from an ill-fitting marital structure became the primary psychological challenge of my middle years, but during my 20s, I lacked the analytical tools to separate the two. Instead, I lived with a pervasive, indistinct sense of misalignment, a constant feeling that the structure of my daily existence was at war with my fundamental identity. A definitive moment occurred during the 8th year of our marriage, late one evening at the kitchen table after the children had gone to sleep. Eli sat watching me with a quiet, penetrating focus that he often utilized when attempting to decipher the unspoken distances between us. He was a deeply intuitive man, far more aware than I typically recognized. He openly questioned my happiness, addressing me by the name Ruth, a pseudonym chosen exclusively for these reflections to preserve privacy, though the specific name is irrelevant to the core of the experience. When I responded by claiming contentment, he paused significantly before noting that contentment was not what he had inquired about. Looking across the table at him, I realized with absolute certainty that he recognized the emotional void within our union, even if he did not comprehend the exact nature of my detachment. He understood that despite my physical presence and domestic cooperation, a vital part of his partner was entirely missing. Unable to offer the complete truth, I provided a partial explanation, attributing my demeanor to exhaustion and the heavy demands of the household during that season. While accurate on a superficial level, we both recognized that it failed to answer his fundamental inquiry. Characteristically, Eli accepted the response and chose not to press the matter further. He would open a door once, but he would never force entry. In the decades that followed, I frequently wished he had demanded more from me that night and in the evenings that succeeded it, forcing me past my superficial deflections and toward a raw confrontation with reality. Though highly distressing for both of us, such an intervention might have accelerated the clarity that took far longer to mature. Yet, Eli was not aggressive by nature, and at 30 years old, I was not a woman who would have welcomed that level of exposure. The comprehensive understanding of my identity developed incrementally throughout my 30s, arriving not through sudden enlightenment, but through a steady gathering of insight. When the full truth finally became impossible to ignore, it proved to be simultaneously uncomplicated and incredibly difficult to face. At 38 years old, the underlying reasons for my lifelong resistance to marriage became entirely clear, catalyzed not by counseling or deliberate introspection, but through the unexpected medium of literature. By that time, I had spent several years navigating life outside the Amish community, having departed at age 31, a separate journey for another day. Among the various subjects I explored during that period of discovery were historical accounts of women's lives, focusing on how women across different eras and societies conceptualized their identities. Although these texts were not written to address my specific circumstances, they consistently mirrored the internal realizations I had been accumulating since childhood. The ultimate realization was liberating. I was not inherently defective, broken, or devoid of the emotional capacities that seemed to come naturally to the women of my youth. Rather, from my earliest days, my fundamental orientation toward existence was simply not constructed around the concept of a romantic partnership, despite the absolute insistence of the culture that raised me. This did not mean I was incapable of deep affection. My love for my children and close companions was profound and enduring. It simply meant that I possessed no natural inclination toward the structural partnership and communal validation that marriage represented. While contemporary language regarding these concepts has evolved significantly, the modern terminology matters far less to me now than the actual substance of the experience. The fundamental truth is that the life presented to me as the sole destination for an honorable woman was entirely incompatible with my true self. The women who established the boundaries of my childhood world acted without malice, simply transmitting the singular generational framework available to them, a framework that contained absolutely no conceptual space for a woman who fundamentally abstained from the desires it mandated. Because our culture lacked a category for my experience, I was left without the means to interpret my own identity, articulate my needs, or explain to my husband the profound emptiness of an outwardly flawless life. Our marriage ultimately dissolved when I reached 35, a complex chapter shaped by numerous factors that cannot be minimized by a single explanation. However, the trajectory toward that conclusion undeniably began with the quiet conversation Eli initiated at our kitchen table so many years before. If this reflection resonates with your own unspoken journey, Consider sharing these insights with those who might find solace in them, or offer your own experiences below, so that we might continue to map these silent spaces together. Let the choices you make in authenticity be the foundation that sustains your life.